Was Paul the Apostle really from Tarsus? Hi, everybody. My name is Robin Walsh. I'm a scholar of New Testament and early Christianity and part of Paths in Biblical Studies. I have a cold, so sorry right off the bat if I sound a little strange. But I wanted to bring you this question for a few reasons. Now, one of them is because this idea that Paul's from Tarsus, it principally comes from Acts of the Apostles. And you've probably heard me in the past say that Acts of the Apostles is not really reliable. I want to break down what I mean by that. And so, what I mean is that most scholars date Acts of the Apostles to about the second century. Now, I know some people want to roll it back to make it even earlier. I'll do another video on how and why we date Acts of the Apostles when we do. It's also the case that some people think, and with good reason, that the author of Acts of the Apostles was also the author of the Gospel of Luke. Again, I'll do another video on this. It makes a good deal of sense, but there's also been some good scholarship out there that points out that the writing style, the vocabulary of Acts of the Apostles differs enough from the Gospel of Luke that there's reasons to question this. So it could be the case that somebody was sort of impersonating Luke and writing a sequel. Again, we'll talk about all of this in another video because I really want to dig down on this Tarsus idea. But the reason I say that Acts of the Apostles is not incredibly reliable, it's not because it's not a great text. It's not because it's not telling a valuable story. It's not because I don't think that it even has some kernels of truth in it about the development of the Jesus movement. But if you accept the idea that Acts of the Apostles, even if you thought it was maybe later in the first century, but if you accept the scholarly opinion that it is second century, what it is clearly doing in this later century, around the time, by the way, that we do have a more established early Christianity, we do actually around this time even have the word Christianity finally popping up on the screen. It's doing the work of creating a foundational tale for the Christ movement. It's answering that question of, if you're thinking about the canon, just for instance, because that's what everybody's the most familiar with. If you open up the New Testament and you start with the Gospel of Matthew, you get that genealogy, you get the story of Jesus. With the Synoptic Gospels, you even have sort of this replication of a story of Jesus just sort of told in different versions or with different perspectives. The Gospel of John has disparate stories. It takes a different tact, but it's not that different from the other gospels. So you've had the story reinforced, but then you would be right in asking, but then what? What happened next? Now, Paul becomes this foundational figure for early Christianity, especially in the second century. I don't think because he founded all of these churches. That's how we tend to imagine him. But if you read several of the letters, and Corinthians is always sort of my go-to with this, the groups are not as cohesive as the imagination in retrospect would have us believe. I mean, his letter to the Romans, he hadn't even been there yet. He hadn't even been to Rome. So that is not his group, the way we tend to imagine early Christian groups being Paul's, belonging to Paul. What Acts of the Apostles does is sort of fill in the blanks on Paul's biography. And that could be because his letters were circulating and because he actually wrote something down. They were valuable for discussion, for thinking about the organization, the institutionalization of the church. You had to create some kind of story for Paul. You had to create some kind of backstory too that really made him more of, again, this foundational figure, but one that really dovetails nicely with this tale of the development of the Christ movement. And so what happens, at least in scholarship, especially, we tend to imagine, if I could put it a certain way, it kind of has that George Washington cherry tree aura to it, meaning when you have something written so many decades later about a figure like Paul, there's a lot that can go out into the ether that's maybe sort of true, sort of not true. And you could fill in the blanks with things that are probable, or maybe, a game of telephone that you've heard, but maybe there are reasons to question them. And so in the case of Paul, I think this idea that he's from Tarsus could be one of them. I think it's a maybe, actually. And it's interesting that this idea that Paul is from Tarsus does come from Acts. He's referenced as Saul from Tarsus. This idea that he's from Tarsus comes up at several points in the text. He never tells us that. The most we know is that he from the area around Damascus. I mean, we have all heard of this tale of his so-called conversion. There's reasons not to use that word, by the way. But this idea of his turning, which is really what the word means, that he changes his perspective. He never quite leaves Judaism. I know we have this idea that he converts from Judaism to Christianity. That's kind of a shorthand for something that's far more complicated. I mean, obviously, he continues to interpret the Jewish law. He thinks Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. He never quite leaves Judaism. And that way, the conversion, sort of that word, gives you that impression. But he tells us he's basically from the region around Damascus. He never tells us he's from Tarsus. Now, why would a later writer, like the author of Acts of the Apostles, say he was from Tarsus? And why also do I think that that's a pretty good guess? Tarsus, I mean, for me, from my modern perspective, when I first started studying the New Testament and early Christianity, Tarsus, what do I know about it? Paul's from there, right? Like that's all I really knew about it. I know that like Cleopatra went there at one point. You occasionally see a blip on the historical radar, but it was actually more of a, you might call it metropolis in antiquity than I think we tend to recognize. The librarian from Pergamum in the late first century BCE, he was actually from Tarsus. Tarsus was known, according to several scholars, and I have the work of a scholar, a Roman historian named Elizabeth Rawson, in mind here, was known for having really, really great schools. But they were schools, especially philosophical schools, that didn't really attract Roman citizens. And that was because the ideal for a Roman citizen at the time of the, I'm thinking here, the first century BCE into the first century CE, the ideal was to be educated in Rome itself or maybe Athens, because the Greeks obviously had this huge hold over Roman imagination. So you kind of wanted to go to Rome or to Athens if you were like an elite, stuck up Roman. I don't know. If you were an elitist in the Roman world, and let's face it, they were, it was kind of like going to the Ivy Leagues, right? Like you would go to either of those two schools. But going to Tarsus was also an option. That if you were in the eastern half of the empire, that was a really great safety school. Maybe not the one that had the most cred from an elite Roman perspective, but still respectable. So that's why you do see figures like these librarians that become quite famous, who are also sort of like, there's a lot of lore around them sort of messing with manuscripts and things like that. And I'll give you some references. But you have those librarians from Tarsus. You also see figures, and I'm going back to the first century BCE here again, like Cicero, and I'm sure you've heard of Cicero, super famous. He would often visit there. So if you read his letters to his friends, he'll talk about, I went to Tarsus and this happened. And it's an educational hub. It's a hub for even elite Romans like Cicero to go to. So if you're filling in Paul's backstory, and if you're in a second century situation, reading Paul's letters, you know how much he adheres to a Middle Platonic ideal and interpretation in his letters. And I've talked about this with his idea, for example, of the pneuma, of spirit. And there are many, many other examples in his letters. He uses a lot of Platonic philosophy. He has a concept of a tripartite soul. A scholar I can recommend on this is also Emil Wasserman, who's written some great books and articles on the idea of the death of the soul that Paul talks about, especially in Romans and around Romans 7. That's all based in a sort of inflected Stoicism that's very influenced at the time also by Platonism. That is all over Paul. So if you're an ancient person reading Paul's letters, you're going to recognize technical philosophical terminology in his letters. You're going to see that he's really good at this kind of philosopher thing, that he's a fairly good, proto-Stoic or Middle Platonist. And so you're going to say to yourself, but he's from the East. Where would he have learned all of this? Well, Tarsus was a major educational hub. It was a major place in the imagination of the Roman world, even though we've sort of lost that touchstone. So yeah, makes sense. He was from Tarsus. You'll notice the text also suggests that he goes to Jerusalem to be educated. That's also strategic, I think. I have less confidence in that idea, but I do have a strong thought that Tarsus, it might be a little bit manufactured. You're never going to prove it either way, but it does reflect the status of Tarsus as a city at that time. In Roman imagination, it makes some sense that he was educated there. But I also think that, again, if you were going to fill in the blanks on something and you had this really well-educated Middle Platonic Pharisee coming from the eastern part of the empire, if you wanted to guess where he was from or where he was educated, Tarsus would be a good bet. I'm going to see if we can't put up a couple of references that Cicero makes to Tarsus. I also have an article where I talk about some of this, and I'll give you the reference to Elizabeth Rawson as well. We'll see if we can't put those in the comments. But something to kind of, I've been keeping an eye on. Whenever I trip over the word Tarsus in my research, I always kind of stop to think how Paul was tied to this idea of Tarsus possibly later on. And again, the aura is, I think I said, the Washington cherry tree. Like, you fill in the blanks with places, examples, sometimes with these figures, especially as you establish them as founding figures. And it's meant to kind of communicate their status, or that could be moral status, but also kind of political citizenship status. And I think it gives you some clue into how people regarded his philosophical chops. If you're interested in these kinds of ideas, go over to bartehrman.com/BSA learning. BSA stands for Biblical Studies Academy. There are a lot of other scholars there debating several issues having to do with the study of the Bible, as well as early Christianity. I tend to do a lot, as you can tell, on Roman religion, the Roman Empire itself, and the context for early Christianity. But we have scholars, over 170 now hours of scholars on a number of different issues pertaining to the study of the Bible, including the Hebrew Bible. So if these topics surrounding the New Testament, the study of the Bible, the Roman world interest you, go over to bartehrman.com/BSA learning. That's bartehrman.com/BSA learning.